Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Failed Economics of Fracking in Pennsylvania webinar presented by the Delaware River Frack Ban and Climate Action Coalition. We have two expert speakers speaking today. Elizabeth Marx, the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Utility Law Project, and Sean O'Leary, Senior Researcher, Energy and Petrochemicals at the Ohio River Valley Institute, who will examine with us the truth about fracking's impacts on our Commonwealth's economy. After they've finished presenting, we'll have time for a question and answer session. And now I will turn it over to Tracy.
Good evening and welcome to the Delaware River Frack Ban and Climate Action Coalition's webinar. As Jera said, we have two experts speaking tonight and we'll be introducing them in a moment. But first, I'd like to briefly set the context for our discussion here in the Delaware River watershed. We're being faced with a new frack attack. There's a ban on fracking throughout the Delaware River watershed since 2021, enacted after 11 years of advocacy on the part of our communities here in the watershed and beyond. We've also been fighting proposed liquefied natural gas export facilities here in the Delaware River ports on both sides of the river, New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and we've been doing that since 2019. So far, nothing has been constructed, but the struggle is escalating. They're trying basically to develop new markets for frack gas to give life support to an uneconomic industry. Governor Shapiro is all in with that, representing those special interests. So are newly elected federal legislators, namely U.S. Senator Dave McCormick, who's championing liquefied natural gas exports from our watershed here in the Delaware River, and Pennsylvania Congressman Rob Bresnahan, who would like to overturn the ban on fracking that we have in place here. And the Trump administration, who want to unleash LNG and unleash economic dominance. So joining the industry's campaign for building an LNG facility on the Delaware River on the southeastern Pennsylvania side are agencies such as the Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development and lobbyists such as Team PA and the building trades. They claim LNG exports and data centers need massive energy from increased fracking, endless development. We'll hear tonight why that's not true and what the real impacts of more natural gas development would do to the Pennsylvania economy. In addition to the economic cost, of course, we know that all the costs of fracking development land on the public, particularly already environmentally overburdened communities. We explored these impacts on the coalition's last webinar that looked at the devastating health harms of fracking in the Commonwealth. And we'll put a link to that in the chat for those who did not attend. Now, let's hear from our featured speakers. First up, I'd like to first introduce Liz Marx. She's from, as you heard, Pulp. And first, I'd like to say that Elizabeth is serving as Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Utility Law Project. It's a statewide specialty legal services project that works to secure just and equitable access to safe and affordable utility services for low-income Pennsylvanians. Elizabeth also serves as chair of the DHS LIHEAP Advisory Committee, the DCED Weatherization Assistance Program Policy Advisory Council, and the DEP Climate Change Advisory Committee, and is a member of the Public Utility Commission's Consumer Advocacy Council. Liz recent testimony before the Pennsylvania House Energy Committee and Consumer Protection Technology and Utilities Committee, that's a mouthful, will be linked to in the chat so you can see what she had to say there. So now I'll turn it over to Elizabeth Marx.
Well, thanks, Tracy. And good evening, everyone. Thanks for spending some time. I do need to note that the Utility Law Project is a nonpartisan organization really focused on our mission on the economic realities facing low-income Pennsylvania families. So I'm going to talk from that perspective this evening about what is happening in the energy space and the impacts to low-income families. If we could go to the next slide. Tracy already mentioned, so I won't spend a lot of time here. Just note that we provide legal representation to groups and individuals. We also provide education and training across the state, as well as policy advocacy on behalf of our client groups. So we also provide supportive services for those who are helping individuals facing utility insecurity. So if we can go to the next slide. Um, Energy insecurity across Pennsylvania is widespread. Energy is essential to modern life. Pennsylvanians need it to heat and cool their homes, power medical devices, cook food, connect with employers, schools, loved ones. Yet, as energy costs continue to rise across the state, an increasing number of families across Pennsylvania are simply being priced out of the market for this basic necessity. In 2025, over 387,000 Pennsylvania families had their electric and gas service involuntarily shut off. This is the highest number of terminations ever recorded. Since 2023, we have hit a new record of terminations each year, surpassing the prior record set during the Great Recession in 2008. So you can see on the charts here that that top line is low-income terminations, and you can see just how much higher it is than general residential termination rates, but all have been increasing over time. And you can notice two spikes I want to point out. Once in 2008 for low-income customers in particular. That was during the housing crisis when economics were tight and we had high unemployment rates. The next spike you saw is in 2014. This is when Pennsylvanians first became acquainted with the term polar vortex. Now we all know it quite well, and energy prices in 2014 skyrocketed as temperatures plummeted. And that's not unlike what is happening this week as gas prices hit massive highs. And we'll talk about that a little more. But let's go to the next slide because I think it's important. In every talk I give, I ground in what happens as a result of energy insecurity. Utility shutoffs, quite simply, make people and communities unhealthy and unsafe and create short and long-term health consequences that exacerbate things like housing access, economic insecurity, and compound costs for families and also communities. The very existence of utility debt can make families ineligible for housing and is an indicator of first-time homelessness. These next couple of slides I'll go through show the average residential gas and electric bills since 2006. This first one, you can see that average gas heating bills have gone from $266 before fracking to $202 today. I'll discuss throughout my talk that the cheap gas boom is actually nearing its end, and for a number of reasons that I'll talk about in just a moment. If we can go to the next slide, this is what has happened to average electric baseload rates from 2006 to 2025. We've seen an increase from $55 to $98, and then in the next slide, is the electric heating rate. So somebody who uses both your general electricity plus you heat with electricity, your average bills have gone from $169 to $350. In short, rates for electric and gas have been far outpacing inflation, to the point where over 1.2 million Pennsylvanians are paying at this point over 10% of their income on home energy costs alone. The greatest increase that we're seeing in energy insecurity is among households with children and seniors on fixed incomes. So if we can go to the next slide, I'm going to talk about four, and I'm going to talk as fast as I can to give you an overview of some of the key drivers of rising energy costs. And there are many factors on this slide, but I'm going to focus in on the first four, and that is data center load growth, gas exports, distribution system build out, and alternative rate making mechanisms, all of which are intimately related to our over reliance on gas in Pennsylvania. So we can go to the next slide. This, before I dive into that first factor, is a key fact that is critical to understanding all of these factors. And that's that Pennsylvania generates 60% of our electricity with gas. So keep this fact in mind. The cost of gas directly affects not only the gas that we use if we are a gas heating customer or we use gas to power our home, but also in our electricity rates. So let's go to the next slide. I'm going to bring us through on data centers. And let's go to the first slide here. Last year, this is a slide showing the capacity markets, and capacity markets blew up 2 years ago. Capacity markets, the best way I've found to explain this is essentially it's the insurance for our grid. We pay a certain price to make sure that there's enough generation available at any given time to serve all of the anticipated load on our energy grid. So, the capacity markets exploded, and a lot of people were going, why, right? And so our grid monitor, the independent market monitor, took a look at it and concluded that data center load growth is the primary reason for the recent spike in capacity costs, which is in turn driving up the cost of our electricity bills. So let's go to the next slide. This shows it for each of the major electric utilities across the state, what the increase in generation rates for electricity have been across the state. And they've really increased between 5 and 30% from December 1, 2024 to December 1, 2025. On average, it's costing residential customers $58 more each month. The cost increase is primarily driven again by that capacity cost, which is in turn driven by the introduction of data centers onto our grid. Let's go to the next slide. So we're estimating, and this is all a lot of data, and I hope you're paying attention to me and not trying to read all this data, but ultimately, we're estimating that across the 4 largest electric utilities, that Pennsylvania customers will pay an average of $78 million more per month for electricity as a result of the introduction of data centers on our grid. Let's go to the next slide. This is impacting not only the rates that we pay, but also the rates we pay for assistance programs. So another rate being driven up by data centers is the cost that we pay annually to provide assistance to low-income families. Because of the introduction of data centers, we will pay $57 million more in Pennsylvania to provide the same amount of assistance that we were providing last year. Now, again, keep that fact in mind that 60% of our generation is with gas in Pennsylvania. More electricity to serve data centers means more gas to make electricity, which means supply for gas is tighter, which means prices go up. It's a supply and demand problem. So this massive cost shift on generation side of your bill, the electricity, is really just the tip of the iceberg with data centers. As data centers are built, more and more costs are being shifted on to residential consumers and Pennsylvania families. So I'm going to turn us to the next slide if we can. I'm going to talk about gas exports, which is the other primary driver rising our energy costs. And if we can go to that first slide, since 2016, LNG export capacity has exploded, forcing Pennsylvanians at this point to compete in the world market for gas that is coming from their backyard. Let's go to the next slide. 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, cut off gas supplies to Europe, and gas prices here at home spiked dramatically. Thereafter, we saw residential terminations of gas service increase 40% over the prior year, and electricity rates for terminations followed suit with 15% spike. This is again because we generate so much electricity reliant on natural gas. We can go to the next slide. This slide isolates, and I want to focus here because you see that spike in 2022. That's when Russia cut off supplies. That is the reliance on gas in Pennsylvania. And when supply gets short, because we now ship it overseas, our prices go up. And you can see that severe spike in 2022. We can go to the next slide. This is the projected load growth or the projected ongoing growth of LNG capacity on our system, meaning we have the capacity to ship more gas overseas, which means prices will continue to go up in Pennsylvania when there is instability in world energy markets. And let's go to that last slide in this section, which just shows that this is projections for what the gas prices will do by 2027. In fact, this projection came out, and it's ironic, it came out last week. And of course, this week, they had projected gas prices to stay pretty stable, but because of the extreme cold in Pennsylvania, gas prices increased to almost where they're projected to go in 2027 as of this week. So it's real time, right? But because the Energy Information Administration is projecting that we will see substantial growth in the cost of gas by 2027 because of the introduction of all of that new LNG gas export capacity. So if we can go to the next slide, I'm going to turn to oh, this is just showing what the spot market prices of gas did this week, right? I pulled this off of the projections as of January 15th. They projected a pretty severe spike, and that pretty severe spike is happening right now. So when extreme weather hits or when world markets go crazy because of world events outside of our control, the price of gas now goes up. It's not unlike the way that oil pricing works now. We ship a lot of oil prices vary because of world markets. Gas has gone from being a commodity we produce and consume in Pennsylvania to being a commodity that we compete with across the world. So let's go to the next slide. Gas utility policies. I'm going to wrap up just a couple minutes on this because this is another big factor in addition to LNG load growth and in addition to the introduction of data centers that are causing our energy prices to spike. Let's go to the next slide. The first is gas infrastructure costs. So I noted earlier gas prices, and I showed you the commodity costs. Gas prices dropped in 2007 after fracked gas exploded onto the market and started, we had pretty cheap gas in Pennsylvania. At that time, what gas utilities started doing was implementing aggressive distribution expansion and replacement programs. So they were building out the distribution centers, and they were also replacing pipes with newer technology. That costs a lot of money, right? And when commodity costs were low, it masked the cost of the programs to build out more gas infrastructure. But as gas costs are now increasing, the total bill remains and goes even higher. And so those costs for infrastructure remain baked into the overall bill. And you can see in this chart, this is the average gas heating bills from 2007 to 2025. And you can see now this is both our commodity costs, the cost of gas, plus the infrastructure costs, the costs of the pipes to deliver gas to us. Combined, our residential gas rates overall are much closer to where they were before the Marcellus gas boom, right? Gas prices, we are now right back to where we were before we were drilling for gas in Pennsylvania. The other thing, and I noted this, is utility policies that are driving rates up as another factor. Excessive utility profits are part of the equation. The Public Utility Commission continually authorizes very high rates of return, and those costs are driving up rates. We generally will, in Pennsylvania, we have some of the highest approved returns on equity, which means that utilities are making profits, and I'll say pretty excessive profits. And if we can, I think I have one more slide here. I would go to, oh, this is a link to my testimony that goes a lot more in detail about many of these factors, as well as talks about solutions. But the last thing I really want to mention, and before I stop, is that utilities are also using rate mechanisms that are pushing uh, risk onto consumers. And so one such rate mechanism is a weather normalization adjustment rider. And anyone that's a gas customer in Pennsylvania may note this on their bill. These essentially charge customers for gas they didn't use based on historical temperatures. So as climate change warms Pennsylvania, these kinds of rate mechanisms increasingly surcharge customers while also undermining efficiency. If you try to use less gas, your bill's going to still go up because the utilities have baked in that normalization profit into their rates. So, these are pretty multifaceted problems and they deserve multifaceted solutions. But, I was here today to talk about the problems, not all the solutions. And I think what I'll close with is that there are a number of ways to get folks involved in some of these policies so that you can share your story. And I saw popping up a lot of folks saying, my bills are really high. We need help. And that is absolutely the case. And there are ways to engage. And so if we can go to my last slide, please don't use that QR code. I learned this afternoon that QR code is broken, but if you go to our website, pautilitylawproject.org, and sign up for our newsletter, you'll get alerts about things like rate cases that are ongoing where you can come and say something about it. And we need an engaged public. So we also provide education and training. And if you need any support, please don't hesitate to reach out. And with that, I'll turn it back to, I think I turn it back to Tracy.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Liz. And we'll have questions for Elizabeth during the Q&A session after we hear from Sean O'Leary. So I'd like to introduce him. He's the senior researcher on energy and petrochemicals at the Ohio River Valley Institute and is a native of Wheeling, West Virginia. He's written about coal, natural gas, and their role in the economies of Appalachia in a book, a newspaper column, and a blog titled The State of My State. Previously, Sean served as communications director at the Northwest Energy Coalition in Seattle, Washington. He recently authored Orvy's Frackalachia Update 2025, Data Centers and LNG Replace Petrochemicals and Hydrogen as the natural gas boom's shiny objects that are destined to disappoint. Another mouthful, but it explains what it's about. Sean's Frackalachia report will be leaked in the chat as we go along. So I'll turn it over now to Sean.
Oh, thank you so much, Tracy. And thank you, everyone, for attending tonight. If we could go to the next slide. What I want to do is to understand the economics of natural gas in our region. And by that, I mean the economic impact, the effects that are actually felt by residents of Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and in particular. We need to look at the total natural gas value chain because when our state legislators, particularly in Pennsylvania, justify projects and subsidies of various kinds, they often do so in the context of extending markets or expanding markets for Pennsylvania natural gas, as though doing so is implicitly of economic benefit to the Commonwealth. And so, we've heard the notion of expanding markets used to justify the effort to do LNG exports from the Delaware River. We've heard it used to justify extensive tax breaks for petrochemical plants, such as the Shell cracker plant in Beaver County, Pennsylvania, and also a number of other facilities. And so the natural gas values chain, of course, starts with the extraction of natural gas, but that natural gas is used for a variety of functions, from various fuels to hydrogen. We've heard about, of course, the prospect of hydrogen hubs, but also, as Liz pointed out a moment ago, direct use of natural gas to heat homes and businesses, and also liquefied natural gas exports. And then most recently, with the advent of data centers on the horizon, it has extended to that. And so, in the comments that I'm about to make, we're going to be looking at all of those aspects of the natural gas value chain to understand how people and communities are actually impacted. If we could go to the next slide. First, I think we have to dispense with a notion that's commonplace in the state, perhaps not among this audience, but among many audiences. And that is the belief that natural gas is a major driver of economic prosperity in Pennsylvania, and particularly a driver of job creation. I would mention that in the last cycle of presidential elections, not only was now Senator McCormick spouting rather grandiose notions of how many jobs fracking is responsible for in Pennsylvania. In this particular ad, 330,000. The Trump campaign suggested 500,000 jobs. Well, actually, we know what the real number is. And at the time of the election last November, it was 18,636, or just a tiny fraction of those jobs. Nonetheless, advertisements like these drive a narrative that makes people believe that not only natural gas is responsible for a huge chunk of Pennsylvania's economy, but also that recent investments that have been announced in data centers and other facilities are also driving great job creation. Next slide, please. And so, what we've done at the Ohio River Valley Institute over the last 6 years is to try to document what the actual impacts of natural gas and its downstream industries have been. And we've done it through a series of what are now 5 reports, including the most recent Frackalachia update, which has been dropped into the chat so that everyone can have access to that. If we could just go to the next slide. The Frackalachia reports focus on the impact of the fracking industry in 30 counties in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. And the reason it focuses on these 30 counties is that collectively, they're responsible for 95% of all the natural gas that's produced in Appalachia. And so while there is some natural gas produced in other counties, it's actually a relatively small component of it. And I should add that because natural gas production has been expanding, between the 2024 edition of our last report and 2025, we've added 8 new counties to Frackalachia based on the amount of natural gas being produced. Now, the real quick breakdown is that there are 11 major natural gas counties in Pennsylvania, 11 in West Virginia, and 8 in Ohio, which you can see are basically broken down between counties that are in the Ohio River Valley and those in Northeast Pennsylvania. If we could go to the next slide. Now, if you were to simply look at top line economic outcomes, you would think that those 30 counties are doing just great. And I say that because for many people, the kind of one-stop shop for assessing economic performance is gross domestic product. If your gross domestic product is growing, the presumption is your economy is probably doing really well. And if your gross domestic product is shrinking, then you've got serious problems. And so if you look at the chart at the left, you'll notice that on the far left-hand side, we look at GDP growth in the US economy as a whole. And you'll note that GDP and income happen to mostly go hand in hand. So, in the US economy, between 2008, at the dawn of the fracking boom, in 2023, GDP grew by a little less than 90%, and so did income. Now, we know that in that same period, if we go to the next set of bars to the right, which represent the combined states of Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, we know these states have not been performing as well as the US economy as a whole. Their GDP and income grew by only 70%. But when you get to Frackalachia, the 30 counties that I just referred to a moment ago, something paradoxical happens. The first thing that you notice is that the blue bar, which represents GDP, represents an almost 100% growth in output, which makes it a much better performer than either the states of Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, or even the national economy. And so, by that measure, which is often, by the way, repeated by policymakers who promote and support the industry, by that measure, Frackalachia is doing just great. But then when you look at the accompanying orange bar that represents income, you'll notice that incomes in Frackalachia are actually significantly below those of the nation and even below those of the region. And that is, from an economic perspective, as I said, a real paradox, because usually GDP growth, output from the total economy, and income go hand in hand. But in Frackalachia, that dynamic is utterly fractured. And that's an important concept to understand because in a few moments, we're going to be talking about data centers, and we're going to see that the economics underlying data centers happen to share the same characteristics that are causing this divergence in Frackalachia. Now, the real question, though, is, GDP is not something that people feel. And so let's look at the metrics of things that people actually feel. Income is one of those. And as we can see, incomes in Frackalachia are growing much more slowly than they are in other places. But if you look at the chart at the right, you'll see that we've also done measurements for jobs and population as well. If you look at the US economy, you'll see that between the beginning of the fracking boom in 2023, that jobs grew by almost 14% and population grew by over 10%. Now, again, when you go to Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, they didn't do as well. In fact, it was the economies in the three states have been relatively stagnant. But look what happened in Frackalachia over in the far lower right-hand corner. In Frackalachia, we have seen not only did growth not keep up with the nation or the state, in Frackalachia, population and jobs are in absolute decline, which is frankly just astonishing given the expansion in the economy. And that is because the natural gas industry is largely responsible for most of the growth in GDP. However, and if we could go to the next slide, however, the central characteristic about the natural gas industry is that it is spectacularly capital intensive and not labor intensive. And as a consequence, little of the wealth that it generates actually lands in local economies. And so we see this illustrated powerfully when we look at, okay, how does Frackalachia, or how would Frackalachia rank for economic outcomes if it were a state? Well, if Frackalachia were a state and we're looking at rankings by GDP, by change in share of GDP that was attained by each state in the period we were just talking about, during that period, Frackalachia would have ranked 13th among all US states for its gain in share of GDP. But when you look to the right at jobs, at income, and population, we see that Frackalachia's gain in GDP was accompanied by double-digit declines in share of jobs, of income, and of population. And you can see how paradoxical that is, because again, when you see GDP going up, which is reflected by the green shading, you can see that jobs, income, and population generally go up as well. And when GDP is not going up, or share of GDP isn't increasing, we see that those measures of felt results tend to be in decline. Frackalachia is spectacularly paradoxical in that case. And so while it was 13th for GDP change, Frackalachia was 50th for job change, 46th for income change, and 52nd in population. If we could go to the next slide. And we can see that this isn't just the case of having a couple of Frackalachian counties that were outliers. The problems that I just described are across the board in Frackalacha. In this chart, you see GDP on the left and the change in share there. But then you go to the columns for jobs, income, and population. And what you see is that out of the 30 Frackalachian counties, and the three variables. So we've got basically 90 data points between jobs, income, and population. 83 times out of 90, Frackalachian counties underperformed the nation as a whole. And so what we know from this is that the effects of the natural gas industry are not episodic. They are not the product of isolated outcomes, but rather the problems that we're dealing with are ones that are structural. If we could go to the next slide. And so the reason, as I said a moment ago, for this phenomenon of growing output accompanied by declines in every measure of felt prosperity is that the natural gas industry, although it involves immense amounts of investment and produces immense amounts of output, very little of that money ever shows up in local economies as income. And as we'll see in a moment, that same characteristic is shared by many of the industries in the natural gas value chain. And there are two in particular that I want to focus on. One of them is power generation, because as Liz pointed out a moment ago, we're expecting to see immense growth in power production and also data centers. Next slide, please. First of all, data centers, as I said, are very capital intensive and not labor intensive. Looking over data centers globally, the average data center employs just 27 people. And that is likely to be the case in Pennsylvania. If we can go to the next slide. Even when data centers are being built and we hear about the immense levels of investment, usually anywhere from $1 billion to $4 or $5 billion for locations. What we need to understand is that only about 2% of those dollars are ever likely to show up in local economies. The vast majority of dollars that are ostensibly invested actually land in places other than the host communities. If we could go to the next slide. And so, and meanwhile, I mentioned power plants a moment ago. You know, the average gas-fired power plant, large utility scale gas-fired power plant, only employs about 30 people. And so what we have in the natural gas value chain is at the top of the chain, we've got natural gas extraction, which we've just learned is spectacularly capital intensive, but provides no measurable job growth. Underneath that, we have the power that's required to drive data centers, but power generation, literally, a power plant is about equivalent in economic impact to an Olive Garden. And finally, we see the same is true of data centers. So what we're doing when we look at that value chain, we're just stacking one capital intensive, non-labor intensive industry on top of another. And the result is very little economic impact for host communities. Next slide. And so that's a problem because we get very little out of it. But there's another element to the problem we're dealing with right now, which is that Pennsylvania has enacted, and other states have as well, including my home state of West Virginia, Kentucky, Ohio, have enacted tax uh, exemptions that basically remove the only significant channel that these industries have for injecting income into local economies. Pennsylvania, like the other states I mentioned, has enacted an across the board exemption from sales and use taxes for data centers, which is the overwhelming source of business revenue that goes to the state. And at the same time, localities are often enacting exemptions from local property taxes for data centers. And so we've created a situation in which, going back just a couple of years, data centers paid about $1.4 billion in taxes. But, and this goes to a point Liz made a moment ago, they are responsible for over $2 billion in increased electric rates. In other words, we are losing more from data centers than we're taking in. And that has a knock-on effect because when all of a sudden you suck $2 billion out of the economy, which means money that people don't have to spend on other things, that costs jobs. In fact, it costs so many jobs that it is very likely that at this point, data centers are actually causing slightly greater job loss than they're causing in job growth. Next slide, please. And so we'll go to the next slide. I'm sorry, because I want to leave plenty of time for questions. The last point that I would like to make is that while we hear a great deal about data centers, much of what is being forecast may in fact not come to fruition, which frankly would be a good thing. But at the same time, it's coming with a cost. When Liz mentioned the rising costs for electricity, the vast majority of that is because not of existing energy usage. In fact, Pennsylvania is now using less energy than it has since 2007. Energy use is not rising in Pennsylvania. Now it may, but it's not right now. However, because of the anticipated need, the forecasts that utilities are making for electricity demand, that is in fact the primary driver of cost increases in our market. And so even though we may wake up one day and find out that we didn't see as much increase in demand for electricity as we thought, we're still going to be holding the bag to pay the bill for all of that excess capacity. Next slide. And so I'll leave it at that, but thank you very much for the opportunity. Please go to the Ohio River Valley Institute because all the data that I've shared is available there. And you can see what I talked about and far more. And Tracy, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Sean. So thank you, Elizabeth and Sean. Again, I'm Tracy Carluccio, Deputy Director of Delaware Riverkeeper Network, and we're going to go now into questions and answers. And some of the questions have already been put into the Q&A box. If you have more questions, please put them in there. And Jairus is going to moderate this portion of it. He's been looking at the chat but mainly the Q&A box as we go along. We also had a couple questions emailed in. So I'm going to hand it over to Jairus to ask questions, and we can each chime in depending on whether you feel you're the person that like to address the question or not. Go ahead.
Thanks, Tracy. First question is, based on the evidence, are there policy or ownership structures that could have preserved more local upside while limiting downside risk, or was the economic model itself fundamentally tilted away from durable community benefit?
Uh, the economic model is tilted away from local community benefit for the reasons I described, that so little money is actually injected either through wages or through taxes into local communities. Now, that said, there are things that communities can do, particularly with respect to data centers, less so with fracking. But on data centers, the first thing that local communities can do is don't abate taxes. Just don't. And if you can convince the state to roll back its exemptions, do that too. But certainly, local communities basically should not, under any circumstances, be abating property taxes for data centers. The second thing is effective zoning for data centers, because data centers pose, and we probably don't have time to get into it, a number of health and quality of life issues that can be addressed to at least some degree by local zoning. And the third thing, going to a point that Liz raised, is that you should encourage your electric utility, whoever that might be, to adopt special rates, special tariffs for data centers that make sure that data centers pay not only for the energy that they use, but also for the infrastructure and support that they require, so that that cost does not fall on consumers.
Yeah, if I can just add one last bit to that, they should also be paying into the assistance programs that are needed as the cost of energy goes up. There are rate assistance programs, LIHEAP, the Low Income Household Energy Assistance Program. There needs to be contributions from those large users into offsetting energy costs that will continue to go up just as a result of supply and demand. The more demand on energy resources, the higher our rates. So absolutely agree with Sean. We need special rates. Those rates not only need to pay for all of the costs that the data centers are causing, but also, helping offset and mitigate other rising energy costs on consumers.
And a good follow-up question to that is, are there examples either in PA or comparable regions where communities redirected investment away from expanded fracking and achieved stronger long-term economic outcomes? And if so, what changed? How did it happen?
Well, if you're able to visit the Ohio River Valley Institute website, look up the Centralia model for economic recovery. And I have to say this, I'm talking to a Pennsylvania audience. This is not a reference to Centralia, Pennsylvania, which we know has its own afflictions. It's a reference to the town of Centralia, Washington, which is an old coal town, which interestingly has an economy that for about 40 years looked almost identical to economies in Appalachia and in the Ohio Valley in particular. And there they lost their coal mine, they lost their coal-fired power plant, but nonetheless experienced an economic revival. And the reason that they were able to achieve that outcome is because, and this point goes to a point, Liz, you were just making a moment ago, they took transition funding and they invested it in things like energy efficiency, helping homeowners and renters and businesses upgrade the energy efficiency of their homes and properties. They invested it in distributed generation. They distributed money in ways that helped people upgrade their homes to the point that they not only reduced their electric bills, they increased the value of their homes. Most importantly, when I described a moment ago that data centers and natural gas are capital intensive and not labor intensive, when you do energy efficiency and home upgrades, you're doing exactly the opposite. These are things that are highly labor intensive, not capital intensive, and that employ local people. And that is an engine that we've demonstrated in Centralia can work wonders to the point that the case was presented at the COP28 conference a couple of years ago in Doha because it was so powerful. And in Pennsylvania, you've got tools with which to do it. You have a Pennsylvania home repair um, program that got, I think, $125 million in funding. If you can multiply that number by about 10, you can have that same kind of impact in Pennsylvania, not just because it's good from an energy perspective, but because it's powerful from an economic development perspective.
Liz, did
Um,
you want to add anything to that or?
Yeah, I mean, I'll add that we do have in Pennsylvania a host of energy efficiency programs, many of which are run by the utilities. We put in um, several $100 million a year into energy efficiency programs. The problem is they're duplicative in terms of application processes. They're very top heavy in terms of administration. They're not working together with home repairs. So we're pairing energy efficiency and home repair in an effective and coordinated manner. And we're still putting light bulbs in. We've got to be doing whole home retrofits, top to bottom, and that requires investment, which employs people. And I would 100% agree with you. And I would say, I've got hearings in the four first energy utilities, energy efficiency and conservation plan tomorrow, right? There needs to be more interest from the public to hold utilities accountable to have more effective programs, more programs focus on deeper whole home measures that can bring energy efficiency and energy rates down and help communities altogether. So, yeah, that's what I'd add.
Thank you, Liz. I wanted to just add, we've got to get back on track to renewables. And we do know that renewables, solar and wind, and coupled with energy efficiency, geothermal, when we put together our programs to actually achieve the reduction of the use of dirty fossil fuels that are fueling the climate crisis, and instead invest in what the trend is across the globe in renewable energy sources that are truly clean and sustainable, we're going to have a healthier economy because that's what a good foundation of our economy is, to be making energy from sources that do not pollute, that do not harm health, and do not take away from the prosperity that our communities deserve to have. Um, so special interest can gain, what their goals are. So let's give a shout out for renewables as well. We do know they make economic sense, and they are the trend of the future. Do we have time for another question, Jairus?
I think so. Yeah, there's a follow-up question actually for Liz. Just to actually to the answer that she provided. Is there a mechanism in PA with public and private water utilities to auto-enroll people on energy assistance or other programs into water assistance related programs?
I love this question. I saw it and I was hoping we would get to it because there are a lot of folks that are trying to work desperately on administrative streamlining, making sure that enrollment in cross programs works. But there is a lot of pushback to get there because that means if you make it easier for people who are eligible for programs to enroll, means the cost of the programs go up. And so, we are being met with tremendous pushback on that, but there are some burgeoning programs that are cross-enrolling. We have a whole trove of data and information from people that apply for energy assistance every year through the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program, or LIHEAP. That data is now being transferred to utilities when an applicant checks a box that says, please, like, give my data to the utility so they can enroll me in their programs. And now the fight is, right now, we are working as hard as we can through litigation with the utilities, quite frankly, to try and push them to begin to use that data that's being shared to actually enroll people. Now, that doesn't go to the water utilities yet, but there are some programs in place right now. A great example is in Philadelphia, the tiered assistance program that gives rate assistance based on a percentage of income for water. They're using data that comes to, it's a municipal utility, so the data is available at the city of Philadelphia, and they're using that to enroll thousands of customers when they apply for assistance. If somebody needs SNAP and food assistance, they need energy and water assistance too. So they should be more streamlined paths to enrollment. And there are a lot of programs in a lot of places. I didn't even mention some of the efforts on the western side of the state. We've been working to try and get a common application for all of the water and energy assistance programs. So a lot of efforts ongoing, and I would encourage folks to get plugged in. And the best way to do that is at public input hearings and a utilities rate proceeding. Show up and say something about the policies that you want to see those utilities use. That is so helpful and a great way for the public to get engaged.
Thanks. Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, Sean. I want to thank our speakers tonight because we're really honored to have such experts come and discuss these important issues with us. We're all being affected, but our communities that have the lowest income are being the most affected. And as we are experiencing single-digit temperatures across the state right now, there's a lot of people suffering, and we can address that suffering and have clean energy too. And that's really what our message is. I want to go to a couple closing slides here to give us a little bit of information. There's some things that we can do now. One of them is to sign the pledge to defend the Delaware River. As I said, we're under a frack attack. They want to build LNG exports here. Of course, we're all experiencing the attack of the data centers and all of our watersheds, but we want to maintain the ban on fracking in the watershed, and we're asking everyone to make a pledge to do that. So if you go to that, and the link is also in the chat there. Also, we have a poll. Is this the moment in time that we should launch a new petition for a moratorium on fracking in Pennsylvania? We really think that we at the Delaware River Frack Ban and Climate Action Coalition, it is. So we want to take the temperature of folks who are attending our webinars. So please go there and let us know what you think. And finally, the last slide, please, Peter. Let's get connected. If you go to Liz and you go to Sean, or you can go to me as a representative of the Delaware River Frack Ban and Climate Action Coalition, we'll get back to you. But go to their websites as well, and the websites were put into the chat. And we'll be sending out a copy of the recording of this webinar and also links to how you can get connected and work on these issues in Pennsylvania. And be able to not just know what the problems are, but also work out what the answers are going to be. So we're bullish on working out those answers, and we believe that we can do that in Pennsylvania as long as we recognize reality and then move towards what we want to see as our reality. Okay, well, thank you again, Sean and Elizabeth. We greatly appreciate you, and we appreciate everybody attending here tonight. We had a great turnout, and we had a great registration, so we know we're going to have many people who will be watching this webinar. Thank you all for attending and taking part, and your excellent questions. Thank you all. Good night.